Blood streamed down Thyra's face as she was dragged by the clan's warriors. "I warned you. The black ships will arrive with the new moon. Death comes from the east," she shouted, her glassy eyes fixed on the horizon where the first Saxon ships appeared as dark silhouettes against the red sky of dusk. It was too late for the people who had called her mad. Thank you for joining us today. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every single subscription truly makes a huge difference in keeping this project alive as we work toward our first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy this story, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world as we bring these ancient voices and struggles to life. The cold bite of dawn pressed against the shore, where jagged stones lay half-buried beneath the restless tide. The air hung heavy with the salty tang of the sea, mingled with the faint scent of damp earth and pine from the cliffs rising beyond the beach. Mist clung low, weaving between driftwood and clusters of seaweed, muffling sound as the waves whispered their endless lament against the rocks. It was a morning like so many others in the Stormfjord village, harsh, raw, and unyielding. Thyra Ragnardottir stepped barefoot over the slick stones, feeling each sharp edge press into her pale skin. Her footsteps left fleeting impressions on the sand, soon swallowed by the returning tide. Her long raven-black hair, rare among her people, was loose and wild, strands tangled by the salt wind that swirled through the narrow cove. The blue-gray tunic she wore hung heavy with moisture, the coarse linen clinging to her slender frame. A marten fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders offered little warmth against the chill that seeped through her bones. At 26 winters, Thyra was young to hold the sacred role of Volva, the priestess of the Stormfjord clan, yet she carried the weight of that position with a grave determination. Her arms, marked with intricate runes etched in ink and soot, were raised now as she knelt beside a patch of sea herbs growing stubbornly between the stones. Her fingers, nimble and pale, brushed through the leaves and flowers, gathering sprigs of meadowsweet and samphire, plants prized for their power to heal wounds and ward off evil spirits. The runes shimmered faintly beneath the skin when she moved, a testament to the magic and faith woven deeply into her being. She closed her eyes and inhaled, drawing the briny air deep into her lungs. The sea whispered to her, voices from beyond the waves caressing her mind in fleeting visions and broken images. It was this connection to the unseen, to the gods and the spirits lingering between worlds, that set Thyra apart from the other villagers. For some, it was a gift, for others, a curse. Even within her own clan, suspicion and doubt shadowed her every step. Behind her, the village stirred to life. Smoke curled from chimneys of wooden homes, their thatched roofs dusted with frost. The muffled clatter of daily tasks began, the rhythmic pounding of a hammer shaping iron, the low murmur of voices starting the day, the occasional bark of a dog chasing after chickens. Children's laughter echoed faintly, light and fleeting amidst the muted gray of morning. Fishermen prepared their nets by the shore, their hands calloused and rough as they knotted lines with practiced ease. The smell of drying fish mingled with burning peat, a scent both comforting and bitter in its reminder of the long winter ahead. Yet, despite the familiar sounds, Thyra felt a hollowness within the village, an undercurrent of unease that no one dared to speak aloud. The seasons had been unkind, the fish yields poorer than before, and the cold seemed to creep earlier with each passing year. The old stories whispered of harsher times, of gods turning their faces away, of doom lurking beyond the horizon. And now, within Thyra's restless heart, the shadows of those ancient fears stirred anew. She rose, clutching the gathered herbs and a small sack of runes carved from bone. The weight of the sacred bones at her side was both a comfort and a reminder of the destiny she could not escape. Her gaze lifted to the sky, where streaks of pale pink and orange were dissolving into the cold blue of early day. The sea lay flat and unbroken, but in its depths, she sensed a storm gathering, not of weather, but of men and blood. Her steps carried her toward the village's edge, where the fishing boats rested on the shore like forgotten carcasses. The wooden hulls were worn by salt and time, their sails furled and patched from countless voyages. A few men worked quietly, hauling gear as their breath steamed in the frigid air. Among them, she saw Leif Thorvaldsen, tall, broad-shouldered, his fiery red beard braided with iron beads that caught the weak sunlight. His face was weather-beaten, strong and stern, with lines carved deep by years of battle and leadership. Leif's eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Respect, perhaps, or doubt. For though he was the clan's chieftain, his faith in Thyra's visions had always been tenuous. She swallowed the knot of frustration rising in her throat. Her warnings, her sacred insights, all dismissed as youthful folly, the product of an overactive imagination rather than divine truth. The burden of being so young in a role steeped in tradition weighed heavily on her. Her mother had been the previous Volva, a woman of quiet strength and unquestioned reverence. Thyra had taken up the mantle after her death, but many still saw her as a child playing at powers beyond her reach. Thyra's thoughts drifted back to the night before, the solstice ritual, when the veil between worlds was thinnest and the gods whispered their secrets through flame and smoke. The great fire had crackled fiercely in the center of the village, its warmth at odds with the biting cold that wrapped around the assembled clan. She had stood at the heart of the circle, chanting prayers in Old Norse, her voice steady though her mind trembled beneath the weight of what she had seen. As she gazed into the flames, images had surged before her eyes. Black ships slicing through the mist like predators, their sails dark as ravens' wings. Warriors clad in unfamiliar armor, bearing axes and spears stained with fresh blood. The village aflame, smoke rising like a cursed altar to the gods. Faces twisted in terror and agony. The new moon rising cold and full of menace. She had come away from the fire shaken, her heart pounding with the certainty of impending doom. When she tried to share her vision, the council had met her with skepticism and scorn. Leif's voice had cut through the room with sharp disbelief. Dreams and tales, Thyra. The sea is wild, and the mind sometimes drifts too far. His words echoed the sentiment of the elders, that the gods had grown silent, that the clan's strength lay not in superstition, but in steel and courage. But Thyra knew better. The runes she cast afterward had confirmed the prophecy, the symbol of Hagalaz, the rune of destruction and chaos, bleeding through her readings with relentless insistence. It was a warning she could not ignore. Now, as the sun climbed higher, the village's rhythm pressed on, indifferent to the storm gathering beyond sight. Thyra moved carefully through the narrow alleys, her boots stirring dry leaves and ash from last season's fires. She passed the smithy where the rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil filled the air, the glowing embers of molten metal casting flickering shadows on soot-streaked faces. The blacksmith, a burly man named Eirik, glanced at her with a nod but said nothing. Like most, he harbored a mix of respect and wariness for the priestess. In this world, where life was measured in strength and blood, her power was both essential and suspect. Thyra's footsteps led her to the small hut where Freyja Gunnardóttir, the healer, tended her garden of medicinal plants. The air here was different, warmer, heavy with the scent of drying herbs and beeswax candles. Freyja's hands moved deftly, sorting bundles of dried yarrow and valerian. "Good morning," Thyra murmured, careful not to startle her friend. Freyja looked up, her amber eyes soft but clouded with worry. "The winds carry more than cold these days," she said quietly. "What troubles you so deeply, Thyra?" Thyra hesitated, then shared the visions in low, urgent tones. Each word was met with a solemn nod. The healer's face pale, the resolve in Astrid's voice was a balm to Thyra's restless spirit. To have an ally not only believe but act on her visions was a rare gift. The Shield Maiden's readiness to journey alone into unknown dangers brought a flicker of hope amidst the gathering shadow. As the day edged toward noon, the village continued its uneasy dance with survival. Fishermen hauled in modest catches, women mended sails and tended fires, children chased each other between cabins. Yet beneath the surface, whispers of unease stirred. Some spoke quietly of omens, the early frost, the unusual silence of the forest animals, the restless dreams haunting even the strongest warriors. Thyra moved among them, speaking softly to families, pressing the urgency of her warnings. Some listened, eyes wide with fear. Others turned away, clutching their pride and disbelief like a shield. The line between faith and doubt was as thin and fragile as the morning mist. That night, the great hall filled with the smell of roasting meat and burning pine. The elders gathered around the fire, their faces carved by time and hardship. Leif sat at the head of the long wooden table, his presence commanding but shadowed by the weight of difficult choices. Thyra stood at the edge of the room, her voice rising over the low hum of conversation. The gods have shown me what is to come. We must prepare, not just our weapons, but our hearts. The Saxons sailed toward us with intent to destroy. Laughter rippled around the hall, harsh and bitter. Enough, Leif declared, his voice sharp as a blade. Your visions bring fear, not strength. We will meet whatever comes with steel and courage, not dreams and superstition. The priestess felt the sting of rejection like a blow, but she stood firm. I only seek to protect my people. The signs are clear. Leif's eyes met hers, hard and unyielding. Then prepare yourself for exile if your words bring more harm than good. The room's atmosphere thickened with tension, a palpable divide between old beliefs and hardened resolve. Thyra's heart beat fiercely beneath her tunic, the runes along her arms seeming to glow faintly in the firelight, a silent testament to the power she bore, even as the clan turned its back. As the feast wore on, Thyra slipped away to the solitude of her small cabin on the village's edge. The walls were adorned with symbols of protection and remembrance, bone amulets, carved wooden figures, and faded tapestries telling stories of gods and heroes long gone. Here, the weight of her role pressed down with crushing force. She knelt before her altar, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Fingers trembling, she pulled the runes from her pouch and cast them upon the woven mat. The stones settled into a pattern dominated by Hagalaz, the rune of hail and destruction, bleeding through the web of fate like an omen written in ice. Tears blurred her sight as she whispered prayers to Freya and Odin, to the spirits of the land and sea. Grant me strength, she begged, to guide my people through the darkness to come. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the mournful cry of a lone raven across the storm-swept fjord. The horizon darkened, the promise of night folding over the land like a shroud. In the stillness, Thyra felt the first stirrings of dread, a premonition as cold and sharp as the edge of a blade. The new moon approached, and with it, the shadow of death. The morning that followed was colder still. Frost glazed the earth in fragile crystals that glittered like shards of broken glass. The village awoke slower, the usual chatter subdued by an unspoken tension. Thyra moved swiftly, preparing bundles of herbs and poultices, gathering small groups of the vulnerable to her cabin to teach them chants and charms for protection. Her eyes searched the sky and sea, seeking signs. The waves were calm, the horizon empty, but the whisper in her bones told her this peace was false. At the water's edge, she found a group of fishermen debating the coming hunt. Their breath clouded in the icy air as they argued the risks and rewards of venturing farther out. Among them, Gunnar Thorvaldsson laughed boisterously, the younger brother of Leif, his fiery hair a wild flame in the pale light. Thyra, he called, voice dripping with mockery. Your visions do not fill our nets, nor do they warm our bones. The sea is cruel, but superstition will not save us. She met his gaze evenly, the weight of her knowledge like a rock in her chest. I only seek to save lives, she replied softly. He spat on the ground, a harsh sound against the quiet dawn. Then save yourself from madness. Turning away, Thyra felt the sting of his words, but forced herself to remain composed. The village was divided, caught between the pride that had sustained them through generations and the fear that now gnawed at their souls. As the sun climbed higher, Astrid returned. She was a shadow of her usual fierce self, her armor battered, a thin trail of dried blood staining her cheek. In her arms, she carried a small child, eyes wide with fright. I found them, Astrid said, voice hoarse but resolute. The Saxons have gathered beyond the eastern ridge. They come in numbers greater than we expected. A hush fell over the crowd that had gathered around Thyra's cabin. The weight of the shield maiden's words settled like a stone in the pit of every stomach. Leif appeared then, his face grim as he listened. The certainty in Astrid's voice left no room for doubt. The time for denial was over. Thyra stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the assembly. We must prepare to leave. The caves in the mountains offer the only refuge from the fire and steel that will come with the new moon. Fear and disbelief battled within the hearts of those present. To abandon their homes, their hearths, was to admit defeat before the fight began. Leif's anger flared. You would see us flee like cowards? We are Vikings. We meet our enemies with axe and shield. Thyra's eyes burned with quiet fury. And yet the gods have shown me the path to survival. To fight blindly without heed to their warnings is to invite death. The council fractured that day, alliances shifting like the restless tides. Some sided with Leif's call to arms, others with Thyra's plea for caution. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fjord as preparations began in earnest. Families gathered what they could carry, children clung to mothers, and the sound of hurried footsteps filled the air. Thyra moved among them, offering solace where she could, tending to the wounded and the terrified. As darkness fell, she stood at the edge of the village, the cold night air biting at her face. The moon, thin and pale, hung low behind the hills. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a wolf shattered the stillness. The first black sails would soon appear upon the horizon, and with them, the reckoning that none yet dared to face. The night deepened, thickening like a cloak over the land, shrouding the village in shadows. The fires that once flickered warmly in the hearths of homes had dwindled to embers, their glow fading under the weight of uncertainty and fear. Thyra moved quietly through the narrow paths, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The wind whispered through the gnarled branches of the pines, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep beneath skin and bone alike. Her footsteps faltered as a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, desperate cry, barely more than a whisper carried on the breeze. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. The village was meant to be settling into uneasy rest, yet here was a plea for help, fragile in the night's cold embrace. Drawing closer, she found the source beneath the skeletal frame of an old oak tree, its bare limbs twisting like frozen fingers against the starless sky. A small figure crouched in the dirt, trembling, wrapped in a threadbare cloak that offered little protection against the creeping frost. The child's face was pale and streaked with dirt, cheeks hollow, eyes wide and shining with raw terror. Thyra knelt slowly, the runes along her arms pulsing faintly in the shadowed light. "Child," she whispered gently, voice soft as a prayer. "What troubles you so? The boy or girl?" Thyra could not tell at first, looked up, lips trembling. I ran away." The voice came, fragile and shaking. They said I was cursed, that I brought bad luck. Thyra's heart clenched. Before the sentence could finish, the crunch of footsteps echoed nearby. Thyra's hand instinctively moved toward the small dagger hidden beneath her cloak, eyes scanning the shadows. Her breath caught as a figure emerged, rough boots dusted with earth, the unmistakable silhouette of Gunnar Thorvaldsson. His face twisted into a sneer, eyes glinting with contempt as he spotted the priestess kneeling beside the child. "What have we here?" he spat, voice low and menacing. "Playing savior to a worthless runt." Thyra rose slowly, the faint glow of the runes along her arms casting an otherworldly light on her pale skin. "She is no runt," Thyra said firmly. "She is one of us, cast out by fear and lies." Gunnar took a step forward, his broad shoulders blocking the weak glow of the distant firelight. "Fear and lies keep this clan strong," he growled. "Not superstition and weakness. You waste your breath, priestess. This child is a burden we cannot afford." Anger flared within Thyra, a fierce flame igniting in her eyes. "And what are you, Gunnar? A man who turns his back on the innocent? A warrior who lets cowardice lead his hand?" Her voice rose, sharp and clear in the still night. "If you have no honor, then you have no place here." The tension thickened, the silent space between them taut like a drawn bowstring. The child huddled closer to Thyra, eyes wide with fear, but flickering with fragile hope. Gunnar's gaze flickered, torn for a brief moment, but the hardness in his jaw returned. "You would bring ruin on us all, with your soft heart and foolish visions," he snarled. "The gods favor strength, not weakness." Thyra stepped closer, unafraid, her voice lowering to a solemn whisper. "Strength is not found in cruelty. It is found in protection, in courage to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. If the Saxons come, it will not be iron alone that saves us, but the spirit of our people." For a long moment, Gunnar said nothing, the firelight dancing across his scarred face. Then, with a bitter laugh, he turned away, boots crunching over frozen leaves. "You play the Volva well," he muttered. "But your time will come. When it does, I will be ready." As he disappeared into the shadows, Thyra gathered the child close, wrapping her arms protectively around the small frame. The weight of the moment settled hard upon her. The village divided, old wounds deepening, and the coming storm threatening to consume them all. The child looked up, eyes bright with tears, and whispered, "Will I be safe with you?" Thyra's voice was steady, a promise forged in fire and faith. "I will protect you. As long as I draw breath, no harm will come to you." They moved slowly back toward the village center, navigating the darkened paths where quiet figures lingered in half-lit doorways, eyes watching but unwilling to speak. Thyra's mind raced. Every step weighed with the knowledge that time was slipping away, like sand through fingers. At the edge of the communal hall, she paused, listening to the muffled voices inside. The elders debated strategy, their words thick with tension and stubborn pride. Leaf's booming voice rang out, cutting through the murmur. "She brings fear," he said. "Fear that will weaken us when we must be strong. We cannot let whispers and shadows dictate our fate." Thyra's gaze hardened as she pressed the child closer, feeling the small heartbeat against her side. "And what of mercy?" she whispered. "What of the lives we might save if we only dared to listen?" The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. Inside the hall, the words of men clashed like steel, but outside, a young priestess clutched a frightened child, carrying the fragile seed of compassion into a world on the brink of destruction. In that moment, Thyra understood the gravity of the path she had chosen, a path not only of visions and prophecy, but of choices that would define the very soul of her people. To protect the vulnerable, to fight against the tide of fear and hatred, was to walk a lonely road, paved with sacrifice and doubt. But it was a road she would not abandon. Not now. Not ever. As the wind howled low through the village, carrying the scent of cold earth and distant fire, Thyra whispered a prayer to the gods, a plea for strength to face what was to come, and for the courage to stand for those who could not stand alone. The new moon hung low beyond the horizon, silent and watchful. The black ships were coming, and with them, the reckoning that would test every bond, every belief, and every heart. Thyra moved through the village with purposeful steps, the frightened child clasped tightly against her side. The small figure trembled beneath the threadbare cloak, their frame fragile and slight, yet clinging to Thyra with a desperate trust that stirred something deep within her chest. The cold night pressed down, its biting fingers seeking to pry apart every shred of warmth and hope. But under Thyra's marten fur cloak, the child found shelter, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat a fragile promise against the encroaching dark. The path toward her cabin was narrow and uneven, lined with frost-kissed stones and skeletal trees stripped bare by the merciless grip of winter. Shadows stretched long and twisted beneath the moonless sky, but Thyra's eyes, accustomed to the dim light, pierced through the gloom with steady determination. She sensed every stirring in the silence, the crunch of frozen leaves, the distant howl of a lone wolf, the heavy breathing of the child pressed close against her side. Arriving at her hut on the edge of the village, Thyra paused before the wooden door, her hand brushing over the carved runes etched into the frame, a silent invocation for protection and sanctuary. The simple dwelling was modest but sacred, its walls infused with the quiet power of generations who had come before. Inside, flickering candlelight danced across woven tapestries and bone charms, casting soft shadows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sea. She gently eased the door open, the creak of the wood barely disturbing the stillness within. The warmth of the small fire pit met her immediately, a smoldering heart that beckoned both body and spirit. Thyra stepped inside, carefully lowering the child onto a bed of furs laid beside the hearth. The child's eyes, wide and wary, scanned the dim room, lingering briefly on the scattered amulets and the faint glow of the runes tattooed along Thyra's forearms. Without words, Thyra moved to a wooden chest near the altar, drawing out a folded cloth and a small bowl of warm water, scented with herbs. She knelt beside the child, her touch gentle and deliberate as she wiped away the dirt and grime clinging to pale skin. The child flinched at first, but the softness in Thyra's eyes quelled the fear that threatened to rise again. Slowly, the child relaxed, a fragile sigh escaping trembling lips. Thyra's fingers brushed a tangled lock of hair aside, revealing a faint mark on the nape of the neck, a delicate tattoo of intertwined waves, likely a symbol from a distant land, whispered to be a token of protection among certain coastal peoples to the south. Thyra's heart tightened. This child was not of their village, but perhaps a soul cast adrift by cruelty and fear, seeking refuge beneath the shadow of the Stormfjord. The child's voice was barely a whisper, words laced with an accent unfamiliar yet tinged with sorrow. "Thank you," came softly, the syllables hesitant but sincere. Thyra caught the subtle lilt, a dialect spoken in the distant isles, a language of hardship and exile. "I am Thyra," she said quietly, "and here you will find safety. No harm will come to you." Her voice was steady, even as the weight of responsibility settled heavier on her shoulders. The child's eyes, a striking shade of pale green flecked with gray, reflected a flicker of hope amidst the lingering shadows. Thyra moved to the fire, stirring the embers with a stick, coaxing warmth to life. She retrieved a small pot of broth, fragrant with herbs and bits of dried fish, the scent soft and nourishing. Returning to the bedside, she offered the bowl with a gentle smile. "Eat. It will give you strength." The child hesitated, fingers curling around the rim but reluctant. Thyra understood. Trust was not easily given, especially to one so young and so deeply wounded. With careful patience, she reached out, brushing a stray tear from the child's cheek with the back of her hand. Hours passed with the fire's glow as their sole companion. Thyra tended to the child's wounds, small scratches and bruises from the journey and the harshness of rejection, cleaning, binding, offering salves mixed by Freya's careful hands. Ira's breathing grew steadier, the tension in her body easing under the warmth and care. Outside, the wind moaned through the barren branches, a mournful song that spoke of change and loss. But inside the small cabin, a fragile sanctuary was forged, one built not of walls or weapons, but of compassion and trust. In the quiet hours before dawn, Thyra found herself watching Ira sleep, the child's face relaxed, unburdened by fear for the first time in what seemed an age. The soft rise and fall of tiny chest beats echoed like a heartbeat shared. A soft murmur escaped Ira's lips, a whisper in her native tongue. Words Thyra could not understand, yet they carried the weight of memory and longing. The child's small hand twitched, reaching instinctively toward the amulet hanging from Thyra's neck. A simple piece of amber, worn smooth by years and steeped in protective power. Thyra allowed the child to touch it, fingers brushing the polished surface. A spark of recognition flickered in Ira's eyes, fleeting but real. In that moment, the priestess understood that healing required more than herbs and fire. It demanded a delicate weaving of patience, presence, and the sacred bonds of trust. Ira was a soul wounded not just by the cold and cruelty of others, but by abandonment and fear. Thyra's own resolve hardened. She would shield this fragile spirit, even if the weight of the coming storm threatened to crush them both. For in protecting Ira, she preserved a piece of hope, a light to kindle in the darkness. As dawn's first pale light crept beneath the shutters, Thyra sat beside the sleeping child, her thoughts heavy with the dangers yet to come. The Saxons were gathering, their black ships a grim shadow on the horizon. But here, in this small cabin on the edge of the world, two souls had found a moment of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and heartbreak. Yet in the quiet connection forged this night, Thyra glimpsed the fragile strength that would carry them through, the unyielding courage to protect, to endure, and to rise again. The harsh winds of winter howled beyond the walls, but inside, a fragile sanctuary stood, a testament to the enduring power of compassion amid the gathering storm. The first light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy of pines, casting mottled shadows upon the frozen ground as Thyra led Ira carefully along the narrow forest path. The child's small fingers clutched tightly to the marten fur cloak wrapped around her, the chill in the air biting through even the thick layers of wool and leather they wore. Each breath came in shallow wisps, visible in the cold morning air, mingling with the soft crunch of boots against frost-hardened leaves and brittle twigs. For days, they had remained hidden within the mountain caves, the steady drip of melting ice echoing through the labyrinthine tunnels, a constant reminder of the precarious sanctuary carved by nature itself. Thyra's presence was a lifeline for the scattered survivors, her whispered prayers, healing salves, and quiet resolve weaving a fragile thread of hope through the darkness. Yet beyond the rocky walls, the world was shifting, and the fragile veil of safety grew thinner with each passing hour. News of the attack had spread like wildfire. Those who had escaped the carnage carried tales of fire and death to neighboring clans, their voices trembling with horror and disbelief. Whispers swirled among the forests and fjords, carried by traders, hunters, and wandering skalds, until every hearth knew of the calamity that had befallen Stormfjord. But along with the sorrow came suspicion, questions about the survivors, about the priestess who had warned of doom, and about the child she had sheltered. Thyra's thoughts were a tangled storm of fear and determination as she stood behind the cluster of rocks that marked the cave's hidden entrance. The wind moaned low through the pines, carrying distant murmurs that sounded like voices, too faint to discern, but too close to ignore. The survivors had grown restless, their faces etched with exhaustion and anxiety. Mothers clutched children who cried softly in their arms. Men sharpened blades with trembling hands, eyes flicking toward every shadow. Iris sat beside the fire, her pale green eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Thyra watched her quietly, noting how the child's gaze often drifted toward the cave's gaping mouth, as if she sensed the shifting tides beyond. A heavy silence hung in the air when a sudden crack, a snapped branch, alerted everyone. Heads snapped toward the forest edge, muscles tensing like drawn bows. From the thicket emerged a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, cloaked in wolf pelts, and carrying a long spear. His face was weathered, lined by sun and hardship, his eyes sharp and cold. He bore the unmistakable markings of the Frostfang clan, a fierce tribe known for their ruthless raids and unyielding loyalty to their own code. His gaze swept over the cave's entrance, lingering on the small group huddled within. Thyra stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. I am Thyra, priestess of Stormfjord. We seek only refuge. The man's eyes narrowed. Stormfjord. Stormfjord survivors? We heard the fires burning and the screams. You and your people are said to have been destroyed. We were attacked, Thyra said steadily. Many lost, but some remain. We hide from those who would finish the slaughter. The stranger's lips tightened. The Frostfang do not trust those who hide. Strength is shown on the field, not in caves beneath the mountain. Why should we not strike you down like the rest? A murmur rippled among the frightened survivors. Thyra's heart clenched. Here, in this moment, the rift between clans was as sharp as any blade. We have nothing to offer but our word, she said, and the truth that those who survive are not cowards, but those chosen to endure. The new threat is greater than old rivalries. The man's eyes flashed with suspicion, but something in Thyra's voice, a quiet conviction, perhaps, gave him pause. He looked past her to the small child curled beside the fire. Who is this? He asked, voice rough but curious. Ira, Thyra answered softly. A child cast out by fear and cruelty. We protect her as one of our own. The stranger grunted. A child is no threat, but the gods have no patience for weakness. Thyra's gaze hardened. Strength is not measured in blood spilled, but in those who stand to protect the broken. A tense silence followed. Then, slowly, the man lowered his spear. I am Bjorn Frostfang, he said. Come with me. The elders must hear this. Reluctantly, Thyra gathered her people, guiding them carefully back through the forest toward the Frostfang stronghold. The journey was fraught with unease. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twig set nerves on edge. Ira clung to Thyra's side, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. At the Frostfang Hall, they were met with harsh stares and skeptical whispers. The great wooden longhouse loomed before them, adorned with shields and banners dyed in deep blues and blacks. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, sweat, and simmering stew. Inside, a circle of elder warriors and chieftains sat heavy with expectation. Bjorn spoke for them, his voice carrying through the hall. These are the survivors of Stormfjord. Their priestess claims a new danger approaches, one that threatens us all. Leif's name was spoken with a mixture of respect and derision. One elder, a tall woman scarred from countless battles, questioned Thyra directly. Why should we believe you? That your visions are true? That your warnings are not merely the ravings of a frightened girl? Thyra met the woman's gaze unflinchingly. Because the enemy moves swiftly and silently. Because the black ships that came upon us will come again, and with greater numbers. Because I carry the burden of prophecy, and because we are all bound by fate. Murmurs rose among the council. Some nodded, others scoffed. The tension was palpable, a fragile thread that could snap with the slightest provocation. Bjorn's voice cut through the clamor. If true, we must prepare. But first, proof is needed. Warriors will scout the eastern ridges. If the Saxons gather, we will know. Thyra's heart thudded in her chest. That night, in the heart of the Frostfang stronghold, plans were forged in whispered conversations and sharp glances. Scouts would be dispatched at first light. Warriors would ready their weapons. And the fragile thread between clans, woven by necessity and fear, would be tested as never before. Outside, the wind howled through the evergreens, carrying with it the distant echo of oars slicing the water and the promise of a reckoning long foretold. Thyra's fingers traced the carved runes on her arm, a silent prayer to the gods who watched unseen. Time was running out. The world had discovered their secret, and with it, the fragile safety of the vulnerable was shattered. In the cold silence, she vowed again. No matter the cost, she would protect those who could not protect themselves. Even as the shadows of war drew ever closer. The morning dawned gray and heavy with frost, the sky a dull expanse of cold steel. Thyra awoke to the sounds of hurried footsteps and low murmurs. The Frostfang warriors had already taken to the forest, their keen eyes scanning for signs of the approaching enemy. Iris stirred, blinking sleepily beneath matted lashes. Thyra lifted her carefully, wrapping the child in thick furs against the chill. Outside, the elders gathered at the longhouse porch, voices urgent and low. Bjorn approached Thyra, his expression grave. "We cannot remain here long," he said. "The Saxons will strike fast. If your people are to survive, they must be moved, hidden deep within the mountains." Thyra nodded, the weight of command settling upon her shoulders like a shroud. "Then we move. Tonight." The day stretched on with agonizing slowness. Children huddled close to trembling mothers. Men checked weapons and shared terse words of resolve and fear. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Who could they trust? Which clans would stand with them? Who would betray them when the flames reached their door? As dusk fell, the survivors began their slow march into the shadowed wilderness, guided by Thyra's steady hand and the whispered prayers of the gods. Behind them, the Frostfang longhouse stood silent and watchful, a bastion of uneasy alliance in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. The forest closed around them like a living wall, the path winding deeper into the mountains where the caves yawned like ancient jaws awaiting the hungry. Thyra's heart hammered with each step, her mind racing with visions both past and yet to come. The black ships would not wait. The Saxons would arrive hungry for conquest and blood. But here, in the cold embrace of stone and shadow, a fragile flame endured, a promise of survival, and a testament to the strength of those who dared to believe when the world turned away. The journey was far from over. The danger had only just begun. The hollow silence that had settled over the mountain caves was shattered by the heavy thud of boots on stone and the low murmur of voices, foreign, sharp, and filled with authority. The survivors inside the cold, jagged refuge stiffened, their eyes darting toward the narrow entrance where shadowed figures now pressed against the dim light. The air hung thick with tension, the faint scent of smoke from torches trailing behind the approaching men seeping into the labyrinthine tunnels. Thyra's heart clenched as she stepped forward, the weight of her role pressing heavily upon her shoulders. Around her, the faces of the clan's remnants were etched with exhaustion, fear, and fragile hope. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes reflecting flickering flames. Men gripped weapons that had been hastily sharpened, their hands trembling slightly despite hardened battle experience. The cave, once a sanctuary, felt less like a refuge now, more like a trap with no way out. Bjorn Frostfang emerged first from the shadows, his wolf pelt cloak brushing against the stone as he carried the burden of leadership with grim resolve. His gaze swept over the cramped space, noting the fractured, weary souls within. Behind him, a contingent of Frostfang warriors followed stiffly, their faces set in expressions of suspicion and readiness for conflict. Thyra met Bjorn's eyes, steady despite the storm within her. "We are your allies," she said quietly, voice firm yet pleading. "We sought refuge here to survive, not to weaken your strength." Bjorn's jaw tightened, the flicker of doubt in his dark eyes unhidden. "Allies do not hide in caves like prey," he said, voice low and sharp. "They stand and fight beside their kin. Stormfjord has fallen because of fear, not courage." The room shifted uneasily. Murmurs rippled through the survivors, the weight of Bjorn's words sinking in like cold steel. Thyra's fingers clenched tightly at her sides. Her gaze found Ira, curled beside a fire pit, pale and fragile, a symbol of the innocence lost to this relentless tide of war. "I stand for my people," Thyra said, voice rising with quiet fury. "Not all battles are won on open fields with bloody blades. Some are fought with wisdom and the will to endure." Bjorn stepped closer, the torchlight flickering over the hard lines of his face. "Endurance is costly," he said. "The Frostfang will not suffer weakness in our ranks. If Stormfjord is to survive, it must prove its strength." Eyes turned to Thyra. She knew this was more than a challenge. It was a test of her place among warriors who valued steel over spirit. The fragile bonds between clans, forged in uneasy necessity, threatened to snap under the strain. Leif Thorvaldson's name had not been spoken here, but his shadow lingered, a reminder of the past and the bitter divisions that had fractured their people. Thyra thought of him, the man who had dismissed her warnings, who had seen her youth as a flaw rather than a strength. Now, in the face of death, those old wounds bled anew. A voice broke the silence, a deep, rough sound that belonged to a man older than Bjorn, his face weathered by countless winters and battles. "We cannot waste time with doubt," he said. "The Saxons approach faster than our fear can fade. If Stormfjord cannot fight, then it will perish. But if it can, then it deserves a place among us." Bjorn nodded slowly, respect mingling with the harshness in his gaze. "Very well. Let Stormfjord prove itself. But know this, fail, and there will be no refuge left." Thyra stepped forward, meeting the council's gaze with a resolve that burned brighter than any torch. "We will fight, not for pride alone, but for survival. For the children, for those who have no voice but ours." The elders exchanged glances. The decision was unspoken but understood. The fate of Stormfjord now hinged on a precarious alliance and the willingness of its people to face annihilation with whatever strength remained. That night, the survivors prepared. The cramped cave was transformed into a makeshift fortress. Men and women sharpened weapons, fastened leather and metal where they could, and whispered prayers to the gods who watched from unseen realms. Thyra moved among them like a silent flame, offering words of comfort, guiding healing rituals, and weaving the ancient chants that called upon ancestral strength. Iris sat close by, her pale green eyes bright even in the flickering firelight. Thyra wrapped her in a thick cloak, whispering promises of protection and hope. The child's small hands clung to hers, a fragile anchor amid the storm. Outside the mountain, the wind howled against the stone, carrying distant sounds, low thuds, the scrape of oars, the murmur of voices like a gathering storm. The Saxon fleet was closing, their black sails darkening the horizon like a pack of wolves descending upon a wounded prey. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the cave's narrow entrance, the uneasy alliance came face to face with the reality of their predicament. The Frostfang warriors took up positions at the mouth of the cave, their spears bristling in the cold air, while the Stormfjord survivors readied themselves behind, clutching crude weapons and worn shields. Thyra stood beside Bjorn, her breath visible in the chill morning air. "We must hold them," she said softly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. "If we fall here, all is lost." Bjorn nodded, his hand resting briefly on the haft of his spear. Then we fight as one. No more divisions. The first clatter of footsteps echoed through the forest as the Saxons appeared, figures clad in dark mail and leather, their faces grim beneath iron helmets. Their eyes, Bjorn's spear plunged with fierce precision, his wolf pelt cloak a banner of defiance. Ira's small figure was safely hidden deeper within the caverns, guarded by the few who could still stand. Hours passed in a blur of sweat, blood, and steel. The Saxons pressed harder, their numbers threatening to overwhelm the cramped defenders. Yet the resolve of Stormfjord's remnants did not waver. They fought not just for their lives but for the soul of their people, for the fragile hope that had kindled in the darkness. At one moment, as a Saxon warrior lunged toward Thyra, she sidestepped, feeling the rush of cold air as the blade narrowly missed. Her eyes met those of the attacker, young, fierce, but uncertain. In that fleeting gaze, she saw not just an enemy, but a reflection of the harsh world they both inhabited. Her voice rose above the chaos. There is more than death to fight for. Remember your kin, your gods, your honor. The words were lost to the clang of battle, but within her heart, they burned like a beacon. As the sun began its slow climb, the Saxons faltered, wearied by the unexpected ferocity of their foes. The defenders, battered but unbroken, held firm. When at last the Saxons withdrew, slipping back into the shadowed forest, a heavy silence fell over the cave. Exhausted warriors leaned on one another, the weight of survival settling deeply. Bjorn turned to Thyra, eyes darkened by fatigue, but shining with newfound respect. You were right. The fight is not always with sword alone. Thyra nodded, her breath ragged but steady. And not all strength is visible. Some is carried in the will to protect what is most fragile. In the stillness, the survivors looked toward each other, not as divided clans, but as a single people reborn from the ashes of loss. The battle had been won, but the war for their future was far from over. Thyra's gaze drifted to the cave's narrow opening, where the morning light spilled like a promise. The road ahead would be long and perilous, marked by trials yet unseen. Yet within her heart, a quiet flame burned, a steadfast hope that through wisdom, courage, and unity, they might carve out a future beyond the shadow of destruction. As the first birds began their hesitant songs, Thyra whispered a prayer to the gods, to Freya for protection, to Odin for wisdom, and to the spirits of the land for strength. The path would be harsh, but they would walk it together. And in the depths of the mountain, beneath the cold stone and endless sky, the people of Stormfjord stood ready to face whatever dawn would bring. The weary silence that followed the Saxons' retreat settled over the caves like a fragile shroud. Fatigue hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint scent of blood and sweat, the metallic tang a bitter reminder of the night's brutal battle. The survivors moved slowly, some leaning heavily on each other, others resting where they stood, eyes glazed with exhaustion and disbelief. They had endured the storm, but the wounds ran deeper than flesh and bone. Thyra sat near the fire's dying embers, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of everything that had transpired. Her heart still pounded in her chest, the adrenaline that had carried her through the fight now ebbing away, leaving a raw ache behind. Her gaze drifted to Ira, the fragile child nestled in a bundle of furs, eyes wide and unblinking despite the warmth of the firelight. The child's small fingers flexed nervously, a faint tremor betraying a lingering fear no battle scar could show. For days, Thyra had protected this child not only from the harsh world outside, but from the invisible wounds carved by cruelty and rejection. Now, after the fight for survival, the quiet aftermath offered a new, more fragile battlefield, one where healing must be earned not through steel but through trust. Bjorn Frostfang approached her cautiously, his wolf pelt cloak dragging behind him as he settled onto a nearby stone. His expression was softened, the hard lines of suspicion giving way to a grudging respect. The long hours of battle had worn down more than just their bodies. It had worn away the walls between them. "You fight with the strength of your ancestors," Bjorn said, voice low but honest. "More than many warriors I have known." Thyra met his gaze, a faint relief stirring in her chest. "We fight because we must. Not for glory, but for those who cannot stand alone." Bjorn nodded slowly. "And the child?" His eyes flicked toward Ira, a question lingering unspoken. "She seems different." Thyra's fingers tightened around the small amulet of amber at her neck. "She is a symbol of what we must protect: hope, innocence, and the future." Her voice was steady, but beneath it lay layers of fierce protectiveness. "Ira carries the scars of exile, but she is no less a part of us." The warrior's gaze lingered, thoughtful and uncertain. "You have shown me that strength can take many forms, priestess. Perhaps we have judged too harshly." His tone was almost an apology, a rare admission among hardened men. The cave's murmur stirred as others began to gather closer, the survivors drawn to the quiet dialogue. Among them were faces etched with relief and sorrow, the shared ordeal binding them in a way words never could. Leif Thorvaldsen emerged from the shadows, his presence as commanding as ever despite the fatigue that clung to his frame. His fiery beard was singed at the edges, and a fresh bruise darkened the skin beneath his eye. Yet his gaze held a new, uncertain light as it settled on Thyra. Their eyes met, a long silence stretching between them, years of tension, doubt, and pride condensed into a single moment. "I was wrong," Leif admitted quietly, his voice stripped of the usual stubborn edge. "I saw your visions as folly, your warnings as fear. But today, you stood where many would have fled. You saved lives." Thyra's chest tightened, the words both balm and burden. "I sought only to protect my people, to listen to the gods and the signs they sent." Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface a tumult of emotions churned: pain, vindication, and a longing for reconciliation. Leif stepped forward, his scarred hands unclenching. "Help me put aside old wounds. The clan needs more than warriors and priests divided by doubt. We need unity." The others watched, some surprised, others hopeful. Astrid Harold's daughter, standing close by, nodded slightly, her green eyes shining with approval and something softer, a quiet respect for Thyra's strength in the face of rejection. Freya, the healer, approached, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears. She placed a gentle hand on Thyra's shoulder. "You have carried a great burden, Thyra. Not just the visions, but the weight of doubt and scorn. But through it all, you never faltered." Thyra's breath hitched, the kindness breaking through the armor she had built around her heart. "Without your strength, I could not have endured. We have all borne this together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Warriors who had once doubted now approached, their expressions softened by shared survival and recognition of Thyra's courage. Gunnar Thorvaldsen's shadow loomed at the entrance, his usual smirk replaced by a grim seriousness. His eyes flicked toward Ira, then to Thyra, the fiery spark of defiance tempered by grudging respect. "You saved us," Gunnar said simply. "Even those of us who scorned you owed you our lives." Thyra met his gaze, the old animosities lingering but restrained by the recent storm. "Survival demands more than pride, Gunnar. It demands that we stand together, even when it is hardest." The room seemed to breathe with newfound life, the walls echoing a fragile hope. The scars of conflict were still there, visible and raw, but so was the promise of healing. Ira stirred, her small hand reaching out toward Thyra. The priestess smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of dark hair from the child's brow. "You are safe now," she whispered. "We are your family." The child's green eyes flickered with fragile trust, the first flickers of belonging lighting her face. As night deepened, the survivors gathered around the fire, their voices low and tentative, stories of loss, moments of bravery, and dreams for a future beyond the shadow of destruction. The walls that had divided them cracked under the weight of shared humanity. Thyra rose, her voice rising above the murmurs. The cold morning air carried a quiet stillness that seemed at odds with the fierce trials the Stormfjord survivors had endured. The mountain caves, once a sanctuary forged by desperation, had become a cradle of new beginnings. Within the rugged stone walls, the clan gathered, not as fractured remnants, but as a reborn people, tempered by loss and bound by shared resolve. Thyra stood near the flickering fire, her breath forming small clouds that vanished swiftly into the crisp air. Her eyes, once haunted by visions of doom, now reflected a softer light, a flicker of hope that endured despite the scars etched deep within her soul. Around her, children's laughter began to weave through the stillness, fragile yet insistent, breaking the heavy silence that had settled like a shroud. Iris sat close by, nestled in the warmth of Freya's careful hands as she tended to the child's frail frame. The wounds of exile and fear had not yet fully healed, but here, within the embrace of the clan, the small girl found a place to belong. Her pale green eyes held a cautious curiosity, mirroring the cautious hope that stirred among the people. For many, the days since the Saxon attack had been a relentless trial, nights spent shivering in the cold, hearts heavy with grief for the lost, and minds weighed down by the burdens of survival. Yet through it all, a quiet transformation had taken root. The old divisions that once splintered Stormfjord's pride were slowly mending, woven together by shared pain and the unspoken understanding that no one could face the darkness alone. Leif Thorvaldsen moved among the gathered, still carrying the imperious bearing of a chieftain, but softened by humility. The scars on his face were reminders not just of battle, but of hard-learned lessons. His gaze often found Thyra's, a silent acknowledgment passing between them, a reconciliation born from respect and the crucible of hardship. "Your visions saved us," Leif had said quietly, the words still echoing in her mind. "I was blind to the truth. Now, I see that strength wears many faces." Thyra had offered no triumph in return, only a solemn nod, and the steady conviction that their survival was not the end, but the beginning of a long path toward renewal. Astrid Harold's daughter patrolled the edge of the camp, her sharp eyes scanning the distant ridges where the first hints of spring crept among the snowdrifts. Her armor was battered, the marks of recent battles etched deeply into its leather and metal. Yet there was a new steadiness in her step, a quiet confidence born from witnessing the power of faith and wisdom alongside the clash of steel. She paused beside Thyra, the early light catching the golden strands woven through her braids. "The clans beyond watch us," Astrid said softly. "They see Stormfjord survivors not as broken, but as reborn. Your courage has forged a legacy." Thyra looked toward the horizon, where the jagged peaks met the awakening sky. "Legacy is not given," she replied. "It is claimed, through sacrifice, through hope, and through the willingness to endure when all seems lost." Freya moved through the camp like a gentle spirit, her amber eyes bright with quiet determination. Her hands, worn and steady, tended to wounds both physical and unseen. Around her neck, the stone of the sun caught the morning light, a symbol of healing and renewal. "The child grows stronger," Freya said, glancing toward Ira, who was now sitting upright, tracing faint circles in the dirt with a trembling finger. "The fear still lingers, but it will fade. Here, she will learn to trust again." Ira's small voice interrupted, soft yet clear. "Will I ever see the sea again?" The question hung in the air, fragile as a thread. Thyra knelt beside the child, placing a gentle hand upon her shoulder. "The sea is part of all of us," she said quietly. "No matter where we walk, its song remains in our hearts. One day, you will stand upon the shore again, strong, unafraid." The child's eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope, a fragile light that mirrored the dawn breaking beyond the cave's mouth. Outside, the land was awakening. The deep snows that had blanketed the fjord were melting, revealing patches of stubborn earth and the first brave shoots of green. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing stone, a breath of life stirring in the wilderness. Among the survivors, plans began to take shape. Plans to rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost, and to forge a future from the ashes of destruction. The caves, once a refuge, could no longer hold the growing needs of the clan. The village of Stormfjord had been razed, but its spirit endured, embodied in the hearts of those who had survived. Leif gathered the council anew, their faces marked by exhaustion and determination. The old wooden hall had been lost, but a new meeting place had been carved within the mountain, a symbol of resilience fashioned from rock and sweat. Stormfjord will rise again, Leif declared, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of responsibility. Not as it was, but as it must be, with wisdom and courage united. The elders nodded, their eyes reflecting a renewed respect for Thyra's guidance. The priestess stood among them, not as a distant seer, but as a leader whose voice carried the weight of truth and the flame of hope. Gunnar Thorvaldsson, once a skeptic and scoffer, now stood quietly among the warriors, his gaze less harsh, his stance less confrontational. The fire of pride still burned within him, but tempered now by an understanding that survival demanded more than steel. Strength is the shield, Gunnar said one evening, glancing toward the flickering fire. But wisdom is the spear that leads us true. Thyra smiled faintly, recognizing in his words the growth that hardship often wrought. Among the tales shared by the firelight, stories emerged not only of battle, but of compassion and sacrifice, of a young priestess who had dared to speak the unspoken, of a shield maiden who risked all to seek the truth, of a child cast out who found refuge in the cold. In these stories, the clan found new roots, deep and tangled, reaching into the soil of memory and dreams. They spoke of the gods not only as distant powers, but as living presences, woven into the fabric of their lives and struggles. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the camp, Thyra stood at the cave entrance, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind was gentler now, carrying with it the scent of thaw and promise. Beside her, Ira reached out, her small hand slipping into the priestess's. The child's face was calm, the fear of yesterday softened by the warmth of belonging. "Will our village be like this forever?" Ira asked, voice barely above a whisper. Thyra's gaze softened. "No," she said. "Stormfjord will live again, in the songs we sing, the homes we build, and the hearts we carry. The gods will flow through us, as the rivers flow to the sea. Change is part of the cycle, and from endings grow new beginnings." The child nodded slowly, eyes bright with fragile faith. As darkness gathered, the clan assembled for a final ritual, a moment of remembrance and renewal. Thyra led the gathering, her voice rising in ancient chant, calling upon the gods and spirits to bless the survivors and guide their path. The flames danced higher, casting flickering light on faces marked by sorrow and hope. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, pine, and earth, the breath of a land healing beneath the weight of its past. In this sacred moment, the clan of Stormfjord was united, not by the walls of a village or the might of arms, but by the unyielding bonds of shared fate and enduring spirit. Leif stood beside Thyra, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We have learned much," he said softly. "May we never forget the cost, nor the promise." Thyra nodded, the runes etched on her arms glowing faintly in the firelight, a silent testament to the power of faith, resilience, and the will to endure. As the night deepened, the voices of the clan rose in song, a song of sorrow, of loss, and of hope. The melody carried beyond the mountain caves, weaving through the trees and across the fjord, a call to the gods and a prayer for the future. In the quiet that followed, Thyra closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the steady pulse of life around her. The child's small hand still clutched, her arms rested gently on her knees, the worn leather of her cloak rustling softly as she shifted. The runes tattooed along her forearms seemed to hum faintly, as if echoing the ancient power that had both burdened and sustained her. They were marks of fate, ink and blood woven into flesh, binding her to a destiny she never sought but could never escape. The child, Ira, curled close by the fire, her small frame illuminated by the faint orange light. Her pale green eyes reflected the flames, flickering with a mix of curiosity and fear that was slowly giving way to trust. Thyra reached out, her fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from the child's face, a gesture gentle enough to speak of safety in a world that had shown her so little. "We have walked through shadow," Thyra whispered, voice low and steady. "But the dawn waits, always. It is up to us to find it." Bjorn Frostfang sat nearby, his wolf pelt cloak drawn tight against the chill. The hardened warrior's expression was softened by the flickering firelight, the lines of battle etched deeply, but his eyes held a spark, the recognition of shared survival and a grudging respect for the priestess who had led them through despair. "You have shown us strength beyond the blade," Bjorn said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. "We fought not just with arms, but with the courage to believe." Thyra nodded, the words stirring the quiet embers of her spirit. Strength is not always in the strike of an axe. Sometimes it is in the will to protect what is fragile, to stand when all else falls. The voices around the fire began to stir, cautious murmurs of plans and dreams. The village, reduced to ashes, was no more than a memory. Yet in the hearts of its people stirred the first whispers of renewal. They spoke of building anew, not just homes, but bonds, of reclaiming what was lost and forging something stronger from the wreckage. Leif Thorvaldsen rose from his place, his face weathered but composed. The scars of battle and regret were evident, but so too was a new humility. His voice carried the weight of lessons learned the hard way. "We were blind," he said, eyes meeting Thyra's with an unspoken apology. "I was blind. Your visions, your warnings were the voices of gods, voices I should have listened to. Now, it is not too late to heed them, to move forward as one." Thyra's heart tightened with a mixture of pain and relief. In that moment, the gulf between priestess and chieftain narrowed, bridged by shared loss and the fragile hope of survival. "We must carry what was lost in our hearts." "Yes," she replied softly, "but we must also carry the future in our hands." Together, Astrid Haraldsdottir stepped forward, her green eyes bright with renewed purpose. The Shield Maiden had fought fiercely, not only against Saxons but against doubt, both in others and within herself. Now, her stance was firm, her loyalty clear. "The clans have seen Stormfjord fall," Astrid said, voice ringing with conviction. "But they will also see us rise. We are not the broken remnants of a defeated people. We are the seed of a new beginning." Freya, the healer, moved through the gathering, her hands gentle but sure. She knelt beside Ira, drawing the child closer and speaking in soft tones, weaving salves and prayers for healing beyond wounds of flesh. "This child is the heart of our hope," Freya said quietly. "She carries the scars of exile, but also the promise of belonging. In her, we see the future, one that can be shaped by kindness as much as by steel." Gunnar Thorvaldsen, once quick to scorn the priestess, stood in thoughtful silence. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, now softened by the toll of battle and loss. His voice was rough but steady. "We owe her more than words," Gunnar admitted, glancing toward Thyra. "She saved us. Even those who doubted will carry that truth forward." The survivors exchanged looks, some reluctant, others hopeful. The old grudges and divisions still lingered, like shadows beneath the surface, but the night's trials had forged a bond thicker than blood and pride. Thyra's eyes drifted to the cave's narrow opening where the first hints of dawn bled through the rocky entrance. The cold morning air carried with it a faint scent of thaw, promising change even in this harsh wilderness. Ira, sensing the shift, reached out and took Thyra's hand, her small fingers curled with a tentative grasp. "Will the sea sing to me again?" the child asked softly. Thyra's gaze softened, the weight of the future pressing against her words. "The sea is never far, child. Its song is in our blood and in the wind. One day, you will stand at its edge, stronger than the storms." The child's eyes brightened with fragile hope, a flicker of light that seemed to warm the shadows within. The survivors gathered, voices rising in ancient chant, a song of remembrance and resolve. The fire crackled and leapt, its flames drawing strength from the voices that honored the fallen and called upon the gods to bless the living. Thyra's voice carried over the crowd, steady and clear. "This night, we remember those who fell. We honor the past and embrace the path ahead. The gods have given us a second chance, a chance to build, to protect, and to believe." Bjorn placed a heavy hand on Thyra's shoulder, a silent pledge of alliance and trust. "Stormfjord lives," he said simply, "not as before, but reborn." The night stretched on, the firelight mingling with the stars that began to pierce the darkened sky. In the stillness, the survivors found a moment of peace, a fragile sanctuary in a world forever changed. Thyra closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of life around her, the steady heartbeat of a people refusing to be broken. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril. The scars of loss would never fully fade. But in the midst of ruin, a fragile hope had taken root, a promise whispered by the wind and carried in the runes that marked her skin. Some truths, she knew, were only understood when the world is at its darkest. Yet even in those moments, the will to endure can shine brightest. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky with hues of pale gold and soft blue, Thyra turned toward the rising sun. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. In the silence between heartbeats, she whispered a final prayer, not for victory, but for the strength to face whatever would come, to protect those who could not protect themselves, to carry the fragile flame of hope through the long winter ahead, and to remind all who would listen that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the sword, but the courage to believe. If this story stirred something within you, the echoes of ancient struggles and timeless courage, join us in the next chapter. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and carry these voices forward. For in remembering, we honor, and in honoring, we live on. In that quiet moment beneath the endless sky, it became clear, sometimes the truest strength comes not from battle cries, but from the softest whispers of hope, the flame that refuses to die.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.